Good evening. Once again, we are sponsored in the memory of Chana Devora Bas Avraham. Sorry, I usually like to post a couple times a week. This week, unfortunately, various things really demanded my attention, but I did want to make sure to post at least once. As the Gemara goes on now, with Rebbe Shimon Bar Yochai and his son Rebbe Eliezer having exited the cave where they spent 13 years. The Gemara tells us as follows. First of all, Rabbi Shimon Amar Lo, Rabbi Shimon said to his son, Bini, my son, Dai la'olam ani ba'ata, that the merit that you and I have is enough to protect the entire world. Bahadi Panya Demali Shabbata. On Friday afternoon, Chazu Ahu Saba, they saw this old man, Davinokit Trey Midani Asa, who was carrying 2 stalks of Hadassim of myrtles, Virohit, and running Bein Hashmashos towards evening. Amrlo, they said to him, Hani Lamalach, why do you have these myrtles? Amrlahu, the man said to him, L'chavod Shabbos, in honor of Shabbos, I'm bringing these myrtles home. V'tiski loch bechad, it should be enough for you to have 1 myrtle. And he answered, Chad kineged, something missing over here. Chad kineged zachor v'chad kineged shamor. That one of these myrtles corresponds to the pasuk of Zacharis Yom HaShabbos, remember it? And the other one corresponds to Shamor, to guard the day of Shabbos. Some of the commentators explain that, as we discussed in the last few shiurim, Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai clearly initially was disturbed at the fact that he didn't see people living every moment of their lives in what he considered to be a state of complete holiness. He was judging them, as we discussed before, and we'll discuss some more in a different share, that possibly a little bit too harshly or much too harshly, that they were involved in matters of this world. But when he saw this man running along with the Hadassim, it really comforted him. Why? Because the idea of Zohar, remember Shabbos, and the idea of Shamor, to guard Shabbos, so it has they have a number of different meanings, but one of them is to remember Shabbos before Shabbos begins, and to guard Shabbos means to hold Shabbos with you even after Shabbos is over. And seeing this man running with these Hadassim to symbolize those words Zohar and Shamor, Rabbi Shimon realized that this man was extending the holiness of Shabbos, not just on the day of Shabbos, but into the mundane week. And he realized that his judgment of people, that they were too involved in the mundane and they were not bringing enough holiness into their lives, that he was mistaken in his understanding of people's behaviors. Shama Rav Pinchas ben Yair Chasnei v'nafik la'ape. Rabbi Pinchas ben Yair, who was the son-in-law of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, heard that he and Rabbi Eliezer had gotten out of the cave, and he came to see him. Now, even though the Gemara says that Rabbi Pinchas ben Yair was Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai's son-in-law, it appears from many other sources that Rabbi Pinchas ben Yair was not Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai's son-in-law, but was actually his father-in-law. And I want to share with you what I found to be a very interesting Zohar I just came across this past Shabbos. It was a Zohar in Parshas Shmini, and while it's not directly connected to what we're learning over here in the story of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, but the Zohar is about Rav Pinchas ben Yair, that one day Rav Pinchas ben Yair was traveling. And along the way, he ran into his grandson, Rebbe Eliezer bar Rabbi Shimon. And they decided that since they were traveling in the same direction, that grandfather and grandson would travel together. And the Zohar says as follows: Adahavu Azli, as they were going, Mata Idan Tzlosa, it came the time to daven. Nachtu, they climbed down from their donkeys, Vitzolu, and they davened. Adahavu Matzli, as they were davening, Kafter Chad Chivya Beragloi Dechamra de Reb Pinchas, a snake came and wrapped itself around the leg of Rav Pinchas ben Yair's donkey. Kosta v'gad trei zimni, the donkey jumped and brayed twice. Basar desaimut slosa, after they finished davening, Amar Rabbi Pinchas ben Yair said, Vaday tsaruhu lebi'ira dili. Really, my donkey deserved to be punished. Da yoma da akdimna, because this morning I got up early, and as I was traveling on my donkey, v'havim marchish ba'oraisa, I was saying over words of Torah. V'averli ba'aser de lechlucha sharia, and my donkey took me to a place of filth where I wasn't allowed to learn Torah. And it was wrong of my donkey to bring me to such a place. So v'hashta mitzarila, so now Hashem is punishing the donkey by having a snake wrap itself around the donkey's foot. Or he didn't know quite why the donkey was upset, but Kamu, they got up. V'chamu, they saw Chatchivya Kater Aragle, they saw the snake wrapped around the donkey's foot. Amar Rabbi Pinchas, and Rabbi Pinchas ben Yair said to the donkey, Chivya, Chivya, snake, snake, Zilva Aschar Kutrech, go and undo your knot. Unwrap yourself from around my donkey's foot. Bikatfura dechura, and go slither off into a hole. Adahachi is nasher chivya, v'nafal kafsiri kafsiri, but before the snake could get itself to a hole, the snake disintegrated. Very interesting story. And there were two things that hit me as I was reading this story. And actually, when I shared it by my Shabbos table, others around the table brought out both points. Number one, the Gemara, I'm not going to read through this whole story now, elsewhere tells the story about how Reb Pinchas ben Yair's donkey was very careful not to eat untithed produce. And the Gemara in many places in Shas uses Rabbi Pinchas ben Yair's donkey as an example that Hashem does not allow something ill to befall the righteous. And the Gemara even says that if the donkey of Rabbi Pinchas ben Yair, Hashem will prevent it from consuming untithed produce, surely Hashem will not allow a tzaddik to commit a sin. So Reb Pinchas ben Yair, the Heilige Chamor, the holy donkey of Reb Pinchas ben Yair, and how is it over here we see that same donkey doing something wrong, taking his master and dragging him as he's learning Torah through a place of filth and disgusting where he's not allowed to learn Torah. If this is the donkey that our sages hold up as the example of a righteous donkey, how did it do something like this? That was what was bothering me. As I mentioned, one of the people at my table last Shabbos, when I told over the story, asked the same question. And then subsequently I thought of an answer. Because even though the Gemara establishes this principle that Hashem will not allow a tzaddik to do something wrong and derives it from the story of the donkey of Pinchas ben Yair, but Tosfos, in a number of places where the Gemara mentions this, Tosfos asks and brings proof from a number of different stories where we find that tzaddikim did mistakenly commit sins. So how can the Gemara possibly say that a tzaddik will never commit a sin and use Rav Pinchas ben Yair's donkey as proof that a tzaddik won't commit a sin when we see in certain places tzaddikim mistakenly committing sins? And Tosfos answers that this principle that Hashem will not allow a tzaddik to commit a sin inadvertently only applies to eating something that the Torah prohibits us from eating. That just as the donkey of Rav Pinchas ben Yair would not eat untithed produce, Hashem would not allow a tzaddik to eat something that the Torah prohibits us from eating. So the righteousness of the donkey was limited only to food, not to anything else. And therefore, in our story, what the donkey seems to have done wrong on this occasion was to have schlepped his master into a place of filth and impurity. So that doesn't contradict the example that the Gemara gives of Rav Pinchas ben Yair's donkey, because it has nothing to do with eating food. The other thing also that hit me as I was reading this story, and again, another person at my table mentioned the same thing on Shabbos, is that the Gemara in Maseches Brachos, where it talks about the necessity and imperative of concentrating during davening and not allowing yourself to get distracted during davening, the example that the Mishnah gives is that even if a person has a snake wrapped around his leg, he should not interrupt himself from davening. And I found it quite fascinating that this Zohar over here, although it's not talking about a snake wrapping itself around the leg of a person that's davening, but it is giving us an example over here of a story of a snake wrapping itself around the leg of a donkey while the donkey's master is davening. And while I have some ideas in my mind of what the message of that is, but I don't feel they're fully formed, and I'm not going to share them just yet. Anyway, thank you very much for listening, and have a very good evening, everybody.